Hello friends. This is the third video I've made about Dublin, Ireland, and I think it will probably be the last one from this city. What you're seeing on screen is Dublin city centre on the day I arrived, January 31st. If I'm not mistaken, this is the River Liffey, filmed from North Wall Quay. On the left would be the Samuel Beckett Bridge, and on the right, Custom House Quay. I'm going to share a few facts about this river. The River Liffey is the most important river in Dublin. It runs through the city from west to east and flows into the Irish Sea, dividing Dublin into two well-known areas, the north side and the south side. Dublin grew around the Liffey because it allowed trade and maritime transport, helped with defense, and connected the city with other regions. The Vikings, who founded the city in the 9th century, chose this location precisely because of the river and its access to the sea. The Liffey is crossed by many bridges. The Ha'penny Bridge is the city's most famous pedestrian bridge. The Samuel Beckett Bridge has a modern design inspired by the shape of an Irish harp. O'Connell Bridge is one of the main links between the north and south of the city. Today, the Liffey is no longer as industrial as it once was. The river has been regenerated with walkways, offices, and cultural areas, and it remains a central part of urban life in Dublin. Although it was known for being heavily polluted for decades, significant efforts have been made in recent years to clean it up and improve its environmental condition. Since I've already given quite a few details about Ireland in my previous videos, I'm going to keep talking a bit more about the river and then move on to other topics. In terms of length, this river ranks around 6th, with a total length of about 125 kilometers. It is surpassed by 5 other rivers, the longest of them being the River Shannon, which is almost 3 times longer at around 360 kilometers. Even so, the River Liffey could still be considered the most important river due to its history and its location in the capital city. I forgot to mention it earlier. 125 kilometers is roughly 78 miles. I'm referring to the length of the River Liffey. If you're watching from abroad, Ireland uses kilometers rather than miles, and the currency here is the euro, the same as in most European countries. Now I'm going to talk about a topic I didn't mention in my previous 2 videos, sport. The 3 most popular sports in Ireland are Gaelic football, hurling, and soccer, or football, as it's called in most countries. The Premier League is extremely popular here, which is something I didn't really realize until I visited, and I've since confirmed it online. That said, the 2 traditional sports I mentioned earlier still seem to be more popular overall in Ireland. I'm going to try to explain the 2 sports I mentioned earlier, which are the most popular in the country. First of all, Gaelic football. Gaelic football is a traditional Irish team sport played between 2 teams of 15 players on a large grass field. In the game, players can kick the round ball or pass it by hand. The aim is to score by kicking or hand passing the ball either between the posts above the crossbar, which is worth 1 point, or into the net under the crossbar for a goal worth 3 points. Players move the ball forward by carrying it, bouncing it, kicking it, or soloing, which means dropping the ball onto the foot and then catching it again while running. Gaelic football is physical, but it's not as violent as rugby. The contact is more controlled, with fewer full tackles and less emphasis on bringing players to the ground. To be honest, I can't really judge it in depth because I've only seen it briefly through a few short videos on this platform. I am glad it's not extreme like rugby. For me, once violence becomes a central element, it stops being a sport, but that's my opinion. Now, let's move on to hurling. Hurling isn't violent by nature, but it can be dangerous due to the speed of the game, the hard ball, and the use of wooden sticks. Most risks today are reduced thanks to protective equipment. For example, there are collisions between players. Even though hurling is not a tackling sport, there is still physical contact, and high-speed collisions can cause bruises, sprains, or heavy falls. There has also historically been a risk to the head. Head injuries used to be one of the main concerns. Today, however, the use of helmets with facial protection is mandatory, which has significantly reduced that risk. So yes, this sport does seem a bit more dangerous. That said, I'm not trying to promote or discourage any sport here. Each person should decide whether a sport is suitable or too risky for them. I'm simply sharing information. Sports also evolve over time. For example, football, soccer, used to be far more extreme than it is today, with very aggressive challenges allowed. At one point, red cards didn't even exist, and before that, there wasn't even a clear concept of a foul. And to wrap up the sports section, there's a question you might be asking yourselves. We've already talked about how Irish people follow the Premier League very closely, but do they have their own domestic football league? The answer is yes. Ireland has its own professional competition called the League of Ireland. It is organized by the Football Association of Ireland and has two main divisions, the Premier Division and the First Division. The clubs are Irish, such as Shamrock Rovers, Bohemians, and St. Patrick's Athletic, and it is standard association football, just like in any other country. However, despite having their own domestic league, for various reasons many people in Ireland tend to follow the Premier League more closely. Now let's move on to another interesting topic that I already mentioned briefly in my previous two videos about Dublin, religion. Generally speaking, Ireland is traditionally associated with Catholicism, while the United Kingdom is more closely associated with Protestantism. From my perspective, religious beliefs are a personal matter and something each individual decides for themselves. That said, it's still useful to look at how religion has historically influenced these regions and how it played a role in certain conflicts. To understand the religious background of Ireland, it helps to briefly look at how Christianity first arrived on the island. Christianity reached Ireland mainly during the 5th century, long before England was fully Christianized. At that time, Ireland was made up of tribal societies that followed Celtic pagan beliefs. One of the most influential figures in the spread of Christianity in Ireland was Patrick, traditionally known as St. Patrick. He and others introduced Christian teachings through preaching and the establishment of monasteries rather than through military conquest. Over time, Christianity became deeply rooted in Irish society, shaping its culture, education, and identity. The form of Christianity that developed in Ireland later became closely connected with the Roman Catholic Church, especially as ties with Rome strengthened over the centuries. As a result, Catholicism came to play a central role in Irish life, long before later religious divisions emerged in the British Isles. What I was reading was only the official version, and it is most likely not free from errors. For instance, I find it hard to believe that there was no military involvement at all. That is why I decided not to continue reading the official account. I know very little about Irish history, but I am familiar with how religion developed in other parts of the world, and that explanation doesn't fully convince me. People often speak about religion in their own countries in a highly exaggerated way when describing how it developed. I'll use the Spanish version of the conquest of the Americas as an example. You will often hear that Spaniards went there mainly to preach and to bring progress to the indigenous populations. However, we can point to the case of El Requerimiento, a legal religious document created in 1513 and used by the Spanish crown during the conquest of the Americas. In essence, it stated that Spaniards had divine authority over those lands and could claim them as their own. If the indigenous peoples resisted, the Spaniards were considered legally entitled to wage war against them, enslave them, confiscate their land and property, and place the blame for the violence on the indigenous population rather than on the conquerors. Another striking detail is that this document was supposedly read aloud, but in Spanish or Latin, languages the indigenous people did not understand. For that reason, I decided not to pursue this topic further and instead stick to the official version, rather than making claims that may not be entirely accurate. Sorry, I think what I said may have been misunderstood, probably because I write in Spanish and use AI for translation, and the meaning ended up being reversed. What I meant is that it is often better not to rely solely on the official version when it comes to religion. This happens quite frequently with religious topics. Wikipedia is not used as much now, but I remember that on religious matters it was often imprecise and showed a lot of bias and control. On one occasion, I translated a text and it was removed, not because the translation was incorrect, but because they said it did not belong there, even though the same content existed in another language. Unfortunately, religion is often surrounded by a great deal of fanaticism. It can be a topic that would otherwise be pleasant to discuss, but depending on where and with whom it is discussed, it can easily turn into the opposite if it is not handled with care and precision. In about a minute, some content will appear that was already shown in another video of mine about Ireland, specifically part of my trip to Malahide. If you've already seen that section in the previous video, you can skip it, although the commentary here will likely be different from the original. The reason I included it is that, at the moment, this channel doesn't seem to have a clearly defined audience, so I felt it made sense to add more context in case someone is watching only this video. After that, I'll be talking about an interesting topic, something quite popular, yet surprisingly, something very few people seem willing to explore in depth. I've decided to do the final part in my native language. I might add English subtitles later on through the platform, or I could just write a summary of what I say in the comments.
Algo que me llamó la atención fue ver todavía luces de Navidad el 31 de enero, y creo que días después todavía seguían. A mí me sorprende que se gaste dinero en eso, teniendo en cuenta la pobreza que hay, porque la verdad es que yo vi un montón de personas sin techo, diría que incluso mucho más que en Londres. Por supuesto me refiero en proporción, obviamente Dublín es más pequeño que Londres. La Navidad en su día era únicamente un día, pero ahora parece ser que ya son varios meses, lo cual a mí, ya digo, simplemente me choca bastante. Porque realmente lo curioso es que cuando tú hablas con personas sobre la Navidad, el 90% suele hablar bastante mal en realidad. O sea, dicen que es una fecha llena de materialismo, que es todo muy artificial, pero aún así uno percibe que a la vez la gente le tiene cierto aprecio desmedido a estas festividades que, como ya digo, realmente no significan nada. Y ahora vamos a pasar a otra cosa, la tala de árboles. En muchos países como Reino Unido o Estados Unidos, ahí se utilizan árboles reales en muchos casos, aunque por supuesto también de plástico. Y lo dicho, se me hace muy raro que realmente se siga haciendo esto, porque obviamente eso es malo para el medio ambiente, y en el caso de los árboles de plástico también. Estos dejan una huella de carbono alta. Entonces, de nuevo, es algo que a mí personalmente me choca. Y más en estos tiempos en los que se suele hablar mucho del medio ambiente, el cambio climático, todo este tipo de cosas. Pero eso, luego viene la Navidad y parece que la gente olvida estos temas tan importantes y por esta festividad pues eso, lo dejan un poco de lado. Y para acabar, vamos a mencionar una tradición que yo pensaba que solo se hacía en España, pero viendo por internet parece ser que también se hace en otros países hispanos. No lo sabía. Pero bueno, es una tradición que puede generar al año más o menos unos 10 fallecimientos. Es la tradición de comer 12 uvas a las 12 de la noche con las campanadas. La verdad es que también es algo que a mí me decepciona muchísimo porque no tiene ninguna lógica. Eso creo que fue porque hubo un exceso de cosechas y lo necesitaron vender. Entonces inventaron eso de las uvas de la suerte. O al menos eso es una de las versiones posibles sobre el origen de esto. Y luego también podemos pensar en el posterior descontrol que hay en ese día por la noche. No hace falta que entre en detalles, yo creo. Bueno, disculpad, al final he decidido extenderme un poco más. Entonces lo que voy a hacer es añadir imágenes al final del vídeo. Y el que quiera quedarse a escucharlo, pues puede hacerlo. Aunque tampoco voy a ser demasiado extenso, pero sí un poquito más, unos minutos más tal vez. Otra cosa podría ser, por ejemplo, la festividad de los Reyes Magos, dar regalos en especial a los niños. A mí me parece un poco negativo también porque es una forma de malcriarles, ¿no? Al final se creen que ellos tienen derecho a recibir regalos de los padres y encima, lo que es peor, mediante mentiras. Yo creo que eso es creo que es negativo definitivamente, ¿no? Porque al final luego crecerán y van a pensar que el relato bíblico se compone de mentiras. Pero no es el caso. Realmente hubieron unos personajes que hicieron unos regalos a Jesús, pero ya está. No, ninguna parte pone que había que hacer regalos a gente, a tus hijos y mentirles. Eso al final yo creo que no es positivo en absoluto. Creo que al final hacer algo mediante mentiras no tiene más sentido. No creo que sea tan atroz realmente regalar algo a tus hijos un día random porque les quieres. Es más, puede ser incluso un regalo de mayor calidad, o se puede hacer incluso más veces si quieres, en noviembre, por ejemplo, otra en febrero. O sea, es que al final no quedas por debajo de nadie necesariamente. Aunque por supuesto tampoco habría que competir con otros padres, ver quién da regalo más caro, ni nada de eso. No estoy diciendo eso, solo digo, es por poner un ejemplo, que realmente no tiene que ser algo de menos calidad. O sea, es simplemente eso. Aunque, insisto, importan más las intenciones. Y a ver, como última reflexión, pensar en lo siguiente, el becerro de oro y la Navidad actual. Yo veo muchas similitudes. En el caso del becerro de oro, no es que quisieran negar a Dios, pero realmente mezclaron la adoración verdadera con la falsa de una forma muy descarada, porque obviamente estaban prohibidas las imágenes. Cualquier cosa, en verdad, que proveniera del ingenio humano, representarlo como si fuera Dios. Entonces ahí vimos su justa indignación. También hay que pensar que la representación del becerro probablemente provenía porque los israelitas habían estado en Egipto, donde era común hacer eso. Y el paralelismo que yo veo con la Navidad es igual. Veo que simplemente están poniendo elementos paganos y lo están añadiendo aquí a la celebración de la Navidad, que todo parece indicar que no es bíblica en absoluto. También la Biblia habla de la puerta estrecha y la puerta ancha. Una conduce a la destrucción y esa es la ancha. Esto me hace reflexionar que tal vez lo que hace la minoría o un grupo muy minoritario es el verdadero y por lo tanto el que se va a salvar de seguro. De ahí mi recomendación a que investiguéis más sobre la Biblia, que es el libro más traducido y distribuido del mundo con diferencia, el que creo que habla de la verdad y que conduce a salvación. Espero haber sido lo más respetuoso y correcto posible y que nadie se haya ofendido por nada que haya dicho, aunque ya digo, estos son temas que por lo general se pueden hablar con otras personas y la gran mayoría piensa casi igual. Es lo que a mí realmente me parece más curioso, que creo que honestamente la gran mayoría saben que esto es algo falso. Luego, por supuesto, habrá otras creencias que para nada es así, que sí que tienen que están más seguros que es cierto, ¿no? Pero ya digo, esto en concreto yo creo que es muy claro, a poco que se investigue, y por lo tanto animo a la gente a que se mantengan al margen en la medida de lo posible, por supuesto sin fanatismos y siempre con respeto. Muchas gracias por haber visto mi vídeo y sobre todo si habéis visto también esta parte. Hasta la próxima.